as well. So firstly, in the Donbass, a number of civilians were killed and others wounded by Russian rocket attacks, thought to be barrel artillery, so normal tubed artillery and Grad rockets fired at Bakhmut. Yesterday, I'd say at least 5 dead and we're told 9 wounded, but those numbers are going up. And the Prosecutor General, Ukraine's Prosecutor General, says they're going to launch criminal proceedings into the attack because it was clearly a civilian target. Elsewhere on the front, slightly further south, so a bit further to the southwest, around the town of Vuhledar, the spokesman for the Ukrainian armed forces there saying that Russia has shifted tactics slightly, scaled down the number of assaults attempted at night. Now, we know that the forces in that area are thought to be regular Russians, i.e. mobilised and conscript soldiers, not the Wagner group. Wagner's around Bakhmut area. Vuhledar was the regular Russian military. Now they've been recently mobilised and conscripted, so they're not as experienced as the Wagner fighters, and we're having much less success, partly as a result of that. So now, whether or not that is part of the cause for this change in tactics, we don't know. But Russia has not achieved any kind of measure of success down in Vuhledar, and that looks likely to continue. Separately, today's British Defence Intelligence report is trying to put a figure on casualties. Now, it's always very difficult to try and talk about casualty numbers, but they've said that they think Russia has lost between 175,000 and 200,000 casualties. Now, casualties are dead, wounded, captured and missing. But they do put a figure on. They think around 60,000 killed. And what they're saying is that's a very high ratio. So say 60,000 killed, let's say 200,000 total casualties. I mean, that's about 1 in 4, which is a high ratio of dead to wounded, missing and captured. And they are suggesting, this is British Defence Intelligence, are suggesting it's the lack of medical care that is the cause for that. And they say, quote, by modern standards, these figures represent a high ratio of personnel killed compared to those wounded. This is almost certainly due to extremely rudimentary medical provision across much of the force, unquote. They also went on to say that the Wagner group, the mercenary group fighting largely around Bakhmut, they've deployed a huge number of convicts, which we know they've been emptying. Prigozhin's been going around emptying the prisons. The deal is do 6 months service and then you have your sentence quashed, i.e. if you're still alive in 6 months, you have your sentence quashed. Whether or not they live up to that deal, but it's not a great one if you're still alive in 6 months. But British MOD is saying that they think Wagner has suffered about a 50% casualty rate. As I said, that's not just dead, that's dead, wounded, missing and captured, but 50% is a huge number. And just separately on the diplomatic front, so Keir Starmer, who is the leader of Britain's Labour Party, the opposition here in the UK, and on current polling, likely to be the next Prime Minister unless something pretty significant happens. We are due an election here, the latest in the UK, and the latest by January 2025. Now, it's very unlikely that there would be an election in January. Governments don't like doing it in winter because you don't really get the vote out. And also January is just it's a bit of a grim month just after Christmas. So in all likelihood, it's going to be sometime before then, and probably not in the immediate run up to Christmas. So we're looking like the back end, sort of summer, autumn of 2024. So that's not far away. The Labour Party is well ahead of the Conservatives at the moment in the polls, so Keir Starmer could well be the Prime Minister of Britain quite soon. He's in Ukraine today on his second trip. He met President Zelensky, and he affirmed that Britain's support for Ukraine under his stewardship, if he was the Prime Minister, would not change at all. Separately, we've got who else? We got Lukashenko, Alexander Lukashenko, President of Belarus. He is in Moscow with Putin now. Whether that is because of or just coincidental, Lukashenko yesterday invited President Biden to Minsk. Biden is due to go to Poland next week, and on the back of that, Lukashenko was saying, well, why is he going to Poland? Why don't we have him here? We can all sit down and we can sort out Ukraine, sort the war out, etc., etc. He didn't say war, but he was talking about that. He said, quote, we are ready to receive him, that's Biden, we're ready to receive him in Minsk and have a serious conversation. If he wants peace in Ukraine, and even Putin will fly to Minsk, and the three of us will meet here, 2 aggressors and a peace-loving president, unquote. Now, he didn't then say which were the 2 aggressors and who was the peace-loving president, but we can discuss that amongst ourselves. I will take a little pause there. There's other bits and pieces going on which we need to speak about. Antony Blinken's made some interesting comments, reportedly, Politico saying about Crimea. We can come back to that a little bit later, but I will just take a breath there.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that. Maria and Jez, thank you very much for joining us. I know we want to speak about quite a bit, but just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you came to be in Manchester? Tell us the story of the past 12 months for you.
Hello, everyone. I am Maria Romanenko. I come from Kiev, from Ukraine, where I lived until late February 2022, even though I did study in the UK before, but that was a while back. On February 24th, I was woken up by my British partner, Jez, who's also on this Twitter Spaces, and we were in the Kiev region, staying at my dad's place. Jez woke me up saying that bombs were being dropped across the country. I couldn't quite believe it. I was still very sleepy and sort of not understand what's going on. And I went on my Twitter and I saw the multiple reports. And what was surprising, that it wasn't just in the East, where we had the warfare since 2014, but it was everywhere. And it was so shocking and quite surreal to see. And Jez was adamant that he wanted to leave because Ukraine is not his country. He didn't want to be caught up in a war in a country that's not his own, but also because he's Jewish and his whole family history. He says he's alive today thanks to people in his family history making the decision to leave before it was too late. So he was adamant that I'm leaving. You can come with me or not, but I'm leaving regardless. And I had about an hour to make that decision whilst my dad and him and Jez went to a petrol station to get some petrol. My dad very kindly agreed to drive Jez to Lviv. And I didn't know what to do, but I decided to at least follow him to Lviv and then see what happens there. Maybe go back with my dad. My dad never had any intention to cross the border or leave. He's very patriotic. He joined his territorial defense forces in the first days, protecting his region when it was occupied. So we ended up going to Lviv. That took us 10 hours. We saw many, many people doing the same journey. There were tanks going in the other direction. I could see it out of my back window. It was quite a surreal experience. It was something that I saw in the Independence Day parade, military parade, but definitely not as a real thing, people just going to war. And then we came to Lviv. We spent a couple of hours there, got a bit of sleep, but we were woken up by hearing a fighter jet overhead. We descended to a bomb shelter, ended up being a Ukrainian plane, so it was all right. And then we went to the border, and that was a very long journey as well. It took us 6 hours just to get from Lviv to the border, and normally it takes just over an hour, but there were so many cars, and there were 19 kilometers before the border itself. The cars just stood still, and there were one lane turned into 4 lanes. People were just trying to use the dirt track, and the other lane going the other direction just to get there faster. We managed to get out after 6 hours just because we used a long cut and we tried to cross through a different border check, and they wouldn't let us through. But then they found out that Jez was British, and the friend who was driving us to the border had a British passport as well because he's from Northern Ireland, so he had a UK passport. And they were like, well, as a thank you for the UK doing so many good things for Ukraine, we'll let you through, but we're not really supposed to do it. So that saved us lots of time. We got to the border, and that was like a pedestrian crossing border between Shehenyi and Medica. And we started queuing there, and it took us 23 hours to do that. And we saw some horrible scenes. I think Jez maybe can tell a bit more about what happened there.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so I'm Jez. I'm Manchester born and bred, Mancunian, and I was doing dual living in between Kiev and Manchester. So I was with Maria at the start of the all-out invasion. When we arrived at the border, there were thousands and thousands of people there. As Maria mentioned, it took us 23 hours to get across. What's not conveyed is the fact that there was little to no organisation to get out, and people were just simply queuing and being crushed in areas just to get out. So our actual journey involved standing up for 23 hours with no toilet facilities, no food, no water. We queued all through the night. The temperature dropped to -4 degrees. There was awful crushing throughout the time, and we saw lots of unsavoury things. There was fighting, there was shouting, there was pushing, and it's not to mention the other issues such as things like Maria started her period whilst we were queuing to get out, and of course there was nowhere for her to go, so she simply had to bleed through her jeans. Eventually we made it into Poland, and the sense of relief that you have when you make it through a traumatic event, we got on the other side and we were just met by an overwhelming sight of generosity, where people were offering lifts to wherever you wanted to go in Poland. They were holding up signs saying, I have 3 spaces going to Warsaw, I have 2 spaces to Krakow, I have 10 spaces to go to Gdansk. And it was fantastic. And then we were provided with sandwiches and coffee, and it was possibly, it was the cheapest instant coffee that you could ever possibly imagine, and yet equally the greatest cup of coffee that we've ever had. The problem that we then faced was, how do we get Maria from Poland into the UK? Maria had applied for her visa sometime earlier, but it turned out that the Home Office had actually lost her visa. They'd sent it to Kyiv, and we weren't able to pick it up because the visa office had actually shut. So we stood outside the British Embassy and we spoke to them. We went to Warsaw and we had a chat with them, and they said, well, there's not a lot we can do. At that moment, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss decided to turn up, and they drove past us and didn't really fancy talking to us very much. So we spoke to the media, and the media we got about 10 organisations to phone up the Home Office, and all saying, we're writing this article on this couple. Can you give us an explanation of where the visa's up to? And eventually, in time, we got a phone call saying that Maria had been granted what's known as a visa waiver, which actually isn't a real thing. It's just, you turn up at the airport, you turn up at passport control, and they say to you, there you go, we will let you in. So we dealt with that. And I'd love to say it was all smooth sailing and we got in perfectly well. But of course, when we actually arrived in England, because Maria didn't have a visa, she was initially detained and then questioned by counter-terrorism police before, after another 3 hours, we were finally allowed to go into the country. So that's how we made it in.
It sounds like it was, as you said, a traumatic and a quite a chaotic experience. And we'll come on to, I think, some of the things that you think the government could improve later. But can we talk a little bit about your time in Manchester now? Part of what you do is welcome and help Ukrainians who've moved to the UK. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do to welcome them and to help them settle in, and some of the issues you face?
So I think, the stories of the journeys of people coming here into the UK, I think they can be split into 3 sections, really. So the first one is kind of like ours. These are the people who got out very early. They got into the car, they got into trains, and they might have had a difficult journey out the way we did, but it wouldn't be something where you actually, most cases, it wouldn't be where you actually experience the bomb shelters, because you leave so early. So it's more of a logistical issue rather than a safety issue. And the second group is probably the ones who waited a couple of days, and they had a really tough time leaving, because these people would have come from somewhere like Mariupol or Sumy, or areas in the north of Ukraine, south, east, where it got really bad very, very quickly. So I know a couple of stories of I know a woman who left from Sumy, and Sumy was occupied, and the center of the city was actually occupied as she was leaving, and they had to drive on these bridges that were constantly bombed by Russia. And she came with her young daughter, and the daughter just basically looked at her in the car and she was like, "Mom, we're not going to die, are we?" So you hear these different stories, and I know other stories of people in Kherson that waited a bit more to get out, and then it was nearly impossible to get out. So these are quite the stories that were of people that it took like a week or something to get out, and sometimes even longer. And some of these people didn't even make it alive, because in the heat, if they waited a couple of months, then it would be already to spring, summer, and in the south of Ukraine it gets really hot in the summer. Some of these people didn't even survive the journey because they died in the car, or they were shelled by the Russians. And I think, Jez, do you want to talk about the third?
Yeah, sure. So the final lot are those that were, for all intents and purposes, they were okay. They had longer time to make their decision. So you have people like, say, for example, Maria's mum. She was safe just before the start of the all-out invasion. She was in Kyiv region, about an hour and a half south of Kyiv, but she was relatively safe, bar lots of air raid sirens and things going overhead. And then she left sort of a couple of months later. And again, by that stage, they had the logistics down. They had everything going, and it was still a long journey, and it was still stressful, but it was relatively comfortable. One of the things I certainly want to touch upon, though, is that when we were queuing and when we were getting crushed and really, really struggling, I certainly didn't know whether I would survive because I was on my own at that stage. Maria had gone ahead of me. And one thing that I wanted to mention was that we met a lot of people fleeing the country and wanted to talk about refugees. And one thing that we actually found out is people say, well, why do people want to come to Britain so much? Why do you want to come here? And what we actually found out was that when you're leaving a country with nothing, and we saw on our journey, we saw women having to unload their small suitcase and put whatever they could into a carrier bag. So their entire life's possessions were reduced down to a carrier bag. And we found out that essentially you want to go anywhere that you have a slight advantage. So if you know a few words of English, or you have a child that studied some English at school, that's a huge benefit over going to France or Germany. If you've got a friend in England, a distant relative, that's your advantage. And then there were some sort of intangible ones, which is Maria certainly met with somebody who was saying, well, England is far enough away to be safe because certain people didn't want to go to Poland in case Putin invaded or attacked there as well. And I think for me, certainly the final one that I heard, which I think surprised me, was the people turning around to us and saying, Boris Johnson is a good man and he will look after us. And so certainly, you know, the reason that we found that people wanted to come to Britain was you know, very, very strange and a myriad of reasons.
Yeah, because that was the other question about how we're helping them. If you want me to move into that, if that's okay, yeah.
Yes, please, yes.
Yeah, so, well, since when I got here, I obviously had a couple of weeks when I just had to take a bit of a breather. And at the same time, we were doing lots of media interviews and things like that. And it was quite, you know, the first couple of weeks were certainly a blur. And it was all while taking in what's going on in my country and worrying about my family who were all in the Kiev region, and Kiev region was occupied. But I tried to, and then, you know, there was this realization that I can actually help people because I'm here. And whilst I would prefer to be in Ukraine, and whilst I didn't want to be in the UK under such circumstances, I can help people because I went to university in the UK before I did my A-levels here. My English is fluent, and I have some knowledge of the country, and I have support that I need. I have my partner here. So many Ukrainians come here and they don't know anyone here. They don't speak much English. They've never been to the UK. It's a completely new environment for them. So I was trying to think how I can help, and one of that thing was setting up the free walking tours of Manchester for Ukrainians. I contacted the Free Manchester Walking Tours company, and I was like, would you like me to translate into Ukrainian? We can do this for Ukrainians. And they were like, we love that idea. We thought how we could help. And now you basically told us the answer. So we did a few of those. I've so far introduced more than 400 Ukrainians to Manchester, telling them about Manchester history, about how important Manchester is. And that was very interesting. But I also did interpreting in other circumstances. I basically registered with a couple of interpreting agencies and used my fluency in English and Ukrainian to help other people navigate the British system in healthcare, housing. And whereas we also set up some WhatsApp groups where we help both hosts and English families who are hosting Ukrainians understand Ukrainians, help them, and do some translation sometimes, but also help Ukrainians who are here find their way to the bank, to the GP, basically signposting them in a way. And we kind of build this like network around our area where we help Ukrainians who are in our area to like introduce them to each other and find hosts for them. I've also done many talks at different places, including the University of Manchester, where there was the first Ukrainian student conference taking place in October, and then done talks in charity events at a couple of synagogues. And obviously I've been just reporting a lot and writing stories and just showing up and kind of talking about Ukraine for the people who can't really talk because they unsafe, and just being a face and kind of represent my own country.
There's quite a lot to get in there, I think. So could I ask, on your walking tours, are there particular areas that Ukrainians are particularly interested in Manchester that they want to know more about, or particular things that they're not particularly interested in? I'm sort of interested in how these cultures are coming together and how you navigate that.
Yeah, sure. So I think, one thing definitely that all Ukrainians probably don't realize how special Manchester is. I didn't realize it myself until I went to my first walking tour as a to listen, not to do it. That was back in, I think, 2021, and I absolutely loved it. And I was like, wow, so there's so much history in Manchester. And it's not just a history that belongs to Manchester, but it's the history that belongs to the whole world, such as the start of the suffragette movement, industrial revolution. Manchester has so many things it can offer to the world, and it has offered to the world. There are definitely some parts that Ukrainians don't care much about Manchester, such as its music scene. So there's a bit in the walking tour where we name Manchester bands like Joy Division, Oasis, and just ask people if they heard of them, and nobody's heard about any of them. And I've noticed that even Oasis, the younger generations definitely don't know who that is. So it's interesting how some parts that are so important to Manchester, Ukrainians don't really care about. But then there are other parts, such as the IRA bomb that destroyed most of central Manchester. I think Ukrainians certainly would have never heard about that, but also they find it interesting how it helped the city rebuild itself and how the people united. Same with the Ariana Grande bombing, because Ukrainians experience similar things. All those Ukrainians who attend, they come from different parts, and certainly some of them have had their home destroyed or the whole city destroyed or most of the city. And hearing about Manchester experiencing a similar thing in the past, I think that gives them some hope. And the same with the Peterloo massacre, they can relate to it because we had the Euromaidan revolution in 2013, 2014. So I think those things where you see how Manchester united and the whole community united, I think they of more interest rather than the music scene and all of that. So we had to adjust our tours as we heard that feedback.
That's really interesting. Jez, do you want to add anything to that?
We actually genuinely covered sort of all of it. There are obviously, I think, things we'll probably talk about in a bit about the problems that they've faced and certainly the cultural differences. I think we'll probably come on to that because there are some interesting quirks, shall we say, in that we've noticed or I've noticed between Ukrainians coming here. And the one thing I would certainly sort of say ahead of anything is that Ukraine is such a huge, huge country, and there's a massive difference between somebody in their early 20s from Lviv and Western Ukraine, right next to the border with Poland, and somebody in their late 60s from Mariupol. It's two completely different cultures, and the generational gap is huge. But no, carry on, please. Ask us more.
Well, let's go on to. I mean, Maria, you were talking about part of what you've been trying to do, you and Jez, is signpost for Ukrainians coming to the UK. Where to get to the bank, how to go to the GP, all that kind of stuff. So could you go into a bit more some of the issues that Ukrainians are finding? And are there areas that you think the UK government could do more and local authorities could be better in?
I think I'll take this one because I'm shall we say, a little more forthright. So when they first arrived, one of the big things that we had were very critical of the Homes for Ukraine scheme because we felt that all of mainland Europe was offering visa-free travel and visa-free access, and the UK government at the time wasn't doing so much. It's a double-edged sword, though. I think I've learned over the last year. On the one hand, it limits those who can come here to those who've got a sponsor. But in the same way, Ukrainians have come here and they have claimed asylum, but although only a few hundred of them. So it kind of works a much better, more comfortable system versus actually claiming asylum where, Ukrainians can come here and they can work once they actually get here. And the standard of accommodation is generally better. One of the big issues, though, is certainly the way Homes for Ukraine has been presented and how it's worked in reality. So hosts were promised wraparound support from councils, and that simply hasn't happened. Whether I guess it's because of the workload and the intensity required, as you mentioned, bank accounts, doctors, jobs, everything like that. There's been a huge administrative burden placed on hosts that they weren't initially told they would have to do. They were told it would be accommodation and perhaps a little food. So that's caused some issues, and it's worked through that. But there's also the other issues where they're the same issues that are faced by anybody whose primary language isn't English or is coming to England for the first time. So For example, when Maria's mum came here and we thought, well, this will be great. The government wants Ukrainians to work. They've got the right to work. So there'll be fantastic language provision. And we went to our local language centre and they said, yes, we can help you. We offer 2 half-days a week. And we can think, well, surely she'll be in full-time language lessons. But it doesn't really touch the sides. On that basis, without significant external help, it would take her years to get her English language skills up to a customer-facing level. Other signs, unrecognised qualifications. So you, as has often been the case, and it's not unusual, if you're a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer or whatever, you've got significant professional qualifications, that they're not transferable. And equally, there's not enough intensive support into training or work. This is, again, nothing unusual. It's the standard problems that are being faced by anybody who's coming to the country who doesn't know the language. There's also the wider problems that the general British public face at large. So there's been huge struggles with finding a dentist. Maria's mum, for example, couldn't find a dentist, so she went back to Ukraine to see a dentist, and within 3 days of returning, a missile struck less than a mile away from where she was. Beyond that, there's a lack of high-quality interpreters from Ukraine. Companies, certainly because of strain on public finance, they often go with the lowest bidder, which means that the companies then can't pay the highest quality interpreters, which means that they often use unqualified interpreters, which is a real shame. As mentioned before, there's the adjustment to British culture. And then you have the biggest struggle of all, which is 95% or so of Ukrainians who are here, unlike refugees who can't go home because they will likely be killed. The Ukrainians here want to go home. They are literally sort of looking and doing everything with 1 foot out of the door the entire time. And so you have the hosts who are saying, you're here, it's an opportunity, make the best of it. And you have Ukrainians kind of going, I want to make the best of it, but really, I just want to go home. I want to get out of this country. And I'm really grateful for being here, but it's not my home.